as a sort of in-between topic, I figured I could just go through and hopefully this is mostly review from the beginning class, but just demonstrate how I go about creating a C-sharp Windows Forms application and how to interact with some of the controls that are common, toolbars, menus, stuff like that. We'll just see how far we get with it. Yeah, just playing around. So, Visual Studio, create a new project. Okay, so now that I'm signed in, I go to language C Sharp, project type Windows, and look for, let's just search for WinForms. Windows Forms app. So I'm not sure exactly what the differences are between the first two templates, but I'm going to go with the first one and we'll see if we hit any problems. Okay, project name. I don't like leaving the default, but how about progress manager, since I plan to play with a progress bar at some point. I'm just going to put the solution in the project in the same folder. If I was going to have a bunch of class libraries or do any kind of other fancy stuff with my project set up, then I might go ahead and keep them separate. But that's the only reason why you wouldn't check this box, is if you're going to have your Windows Forms project and then a class library or some other kind of project next to it. Yeah, that's fine. .NET 8 long-term support. Okay, so let it finish doing its thing. So it names the form form1.cs to start with, which is usually not what you want to leave it. And you probably already talked about the difference between the form.cs and the formdesigner.cs, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's a beautiful thing when they created this partial class in C# so that we could separate the generated code from the code that you're going to customize. It was a brilliant choice to do that in the language, I thought. But I can right-click on Form 1 and rename happily to, let's say, Progress Manager Form. Let it do all of the other references through the designer code and everything else, and that way I don't have to do anything. If I hit build, then, yep, it has succeeded, so didn't screw anything up yet. The Form 1 is still up here on the properties, so I want to make sure I've got my properties available. So I right click and say properties, it shows up. Text Form 1, I'm going to change it to Progress Manager. So now I've got a program. So I can run it. And there's my program. But no functionality yet. All I can do is run it and close it. So let's see. We also want to say view toolbox so we can see our stuff, and I like to pin it so it stays up here. Common controls. So if you look at the section called common controls, we should be able to look through that list, and if it's common, we should know how to use every one of these, when you would pick it, how you would interact with it, etc., right? I'm guessing that you didn't have time in the beginning class to use every one of these controls in your application. It was probably just representative ones like the text box, the label, things like that, buttons. I also like making sure that I know how to use the stuff in the containers group. So I'm going to create a group box here. Did you guys use docking and go through all the options for docking? Docking is a cool thing. I can move this stuff around. One of the pet peeves, so when I started programming Windows, I was inundated with the Windows user interface guidelines. And some of the things that they would talk about is the proper amount of white space and alignment between controls of various types. So my normal reaction is when I get a control, I'm not going to leave it stuck up there tied to the border of the window. I'm going to drag it away from there a little bit, and it's got snap points. So you see the little lines appear as I'm dragging, and so that gives you just a helper to say, yeah, that looks like about the right amount of space away from the border. But then what happens when I start resizing my parent? I would like for that to resize with the parent, right? So first of all, let me change the text. I'll just call it progress bar for lack of anything better at this point. And if I come down here and look at let's see, there should be something around here called locked, or where is it? Anchor. Here we go. So right now it's anchored to the top left, which means that the position of the top left of the box is always going to be the same number of pixels from the top left of the form or the parent. Okay, I really want it to stay locked with the top right and left. So I'm going to click the little bar to the right, and now when I notice the size changes. It didn't automatically move it all the way to the right, but it's keeping the right side of the group box the same number of pixels from the right side of the parent. Now I can drag it over here and see I get the same little snap helper when I get close. And now it's the right distance away, and it dynamically resizes with the form of the parent. Now this is good to do when you're designing your form just in general, even if eventually I may go to this form and I may say there's something in here for sizing, auto size mode, grow and shrink, grow only, or I may say auto size. No, there's something in here for sizable. It's something like can resize. That's the hardest thing about this, is remembering what the name of all the properties are. Form, border, style, sizable. If I say, I like fixed dialogue, because it leaves it looking the same, but it doesn't let you change the size of it. So if I run this now, it'll let you change it in the designer, but notice now I don't get the arrows to allow me to resize. It's going to keep it that width. Okay, so that's once I decide I'm done designing and want to lock it, right? So I can change it in here still, and when I run it, it'll now be this size, or I can make it smaller and now it'll be this size. But it's handy when you're trying to add controls and, to keep everything pinned and to be able to resize it in here, but then change the border style to fixed dialogue, or you can try some of the other ones. You can say fixed 3D. That's a good one. Okay, so now it's got a nice, pleasant looking 3D look to the border. And Windows handles drawing all those for you for all the Windows, all the .NET Windows, so that's nice. But it can't be sized by the user. So anyway, play with that to your heart's content. All right, so in here, we may want to do other stuff. Let's say we want I'm going to move this down for the time being. Let's say I want a menu. Did you guys do menus before? Menus are fun. We need to know how to use menus. Where is it? Menus and toolbars. So they call it the menu strip. That's the name of the object. And I want to dock this to the, so I had, focus was on the progress bar when I did that. So it added the menu to the progress bar. It'll do that with all the controls. So I want to click outside the progress bar. So now focus is on the outer window. Now when I double click on the menu strip, it puts it on the parent form. That would be kind of weird to have a menu on my progress bar group box. All right, so now I get this blank menu bar. And so I start building it up. Now I have just sort of a standard pattern because I know all of the little things that it's going to do when it generates this code. So I'll try not to skip over any of those little shortcuts. Every time I add a control to the window, I'm always going to come over here and change the name and possibly the text of it. I don't care about the text on this one yet, but the name, the name menu strip 1. No, I might just say menu progress manager. So that's the progress manager Windows menu. So I try to always do that. Because that way if I double click on anything, it's going to use the word progress manager instead of menu 1. I want the code generator to use my generated names. And you'll forget that. I forget it all the time. And what it means is that you'll go look at your code and it'll be button 1 _ click. And then you got to go tracing around through your code and the generated code and the designer CS to try to track down all those references to get it renamed. So it's just a little odd. Okay, building up a menu. Again, I go back to the Windows User Interface Guidelines. So what I typically do, I start out with file. So I type ampersand FILE. Why do I do that? See the little underscore or the little underline? Maybe you can't see it on the screen, but there's a little underline under the F. Whatever character follows the ampersand when you type it in there, that becomes the shortcut key for that menu item. That's how it works. So next, underneath, so when you enter the menu item at the top level, it automatically enters a blank place to create a new sub menu item underneath it. So I'm going to click on the type here and say ampersand OPEN. And on this one, I'm also going to say ... And that's just a cosmetic thing to let the user know that, hey, when you click this menu item, a dialog box is going to appear. You're going to have to enter more options. As opposed to, if you don't have the ... you're telling the user that when you click this, some action is going to be taken. Right? You're not going to get another chance to say, okay, cancel. Right? It's going to immediately happen. So it's just a Windows User Interface Guideline thing. And if you start looking at things like, this changed at some point. If you look at the menu item, just as an example, Windows application that I consider to be well behaved, which is Visual Studio, if you look at the file menu, there's no underline under any of these. However, if I hit the Alt key on my keyboard, the underline F showed up. So they kind of split that. They said, we're going to make it look good to people that like to use the mouse when they're using the mouse. And if they decide they're going to tell us that they're using the keyboard right now, we're going to make it look good for the people that use the keyboard too, to help you remember what the keystroke is, what the shortcut key is. So when I hit the Alt key, the F underline there, so I hit F, and then I get the sub menus for that. And now the new, it doesn't have the dot 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 on the new or the open, but it does have the little arrow over here on the side to say that there's another menu of options. So if I go to the open file, notice the file has the dot dot dot. So when I click on that, I would expect to get a dialog box to appear. And so we want to try to mimic that behavior. So I always try to tell people, if you go to Word, if you just run Word and create an empty document, you can see what Microsoft believes the current user interface guidelines are. Now see, they've changed Office. The people that produce the Office application at Microsoft are doing it the same way that the Visual Studio people do. So that's even weirder. So I personally don't agree with that. I think they should be consistent. You're teaching your users to use one application one way and another application the other way. And that was one of the big powerful things about Windows back in the day, is that, hey, your company should adopt Windows and Windows applications because they're all going to be using the Windows user interface guidelines, which means your training costs are going to be lower because your users, if they can use Windows, they automatically know how to use all these other tools. Now that was a completely different generation of people that had never used a computer before, let alone seen Windows, Mac, Chromebook, phones of various different sizes, iPads. There's a whole bunch of different paradigms out there now, and people are, I guess, more comfortable or at least tolerant of the user interface paradigm shifting depending on the device they're on or the program that they're using. I don't like it. I'm an old guy. I liked and was very comfortable with the Windows user interface guidelines, but the recommendation, the point that I'm trying to make still stands. Go find what you consider a well-behaved Windows application and see how they do it and try to follow it. Visual Studio is one of those. So if you're building a Windows application, the good thing is you've got Visual Studio sitting there and you can use that and mimic what they're doing. So the little dot, dot, dot. Notice out here on the side, it also has the shortcut key. We also have that available to us. So if I select this open and come down here in the properties, there's a shortcut key and it's by default set to none. So let's say I want Control O to invoke the file open menu item. Then I can click this, click the little drop down. I'll check the control and the key. I will come down here and try to find the O character. Yeah, so now it's Control O, and now my menu is being rendered with the Control O next to it. Pretty cool. And I got all of that in the designer for free, basically, and didn't have to write any code to do that myself. The only code that I have to worry about is what gets called, what code gets executed when you invoke that menu item. And as you probably already can anticipate from the other class, if I double click on open, then it will automatically generate a method in my form class. This one, it happened to call open tool strip menu item underscore click. So this is the code that gets called when you click on or invoke that menu item. So let's say I just want to do something quick, messagebox.show hello open menu item. Okay, if I run my program, here it is. I can either click File and click Open. There's my menu or my message box. Or I can hit the Alt key, F, O, that invoked it. Or I can say Control O, and that invoked it. Lots of different ways to get to the same place. Does that make sense? I also like how it's, I can either hit the Alt key, let it off, the F key, let it off, and the O key, let it off. Or I can just hold the Alt key down and say Alt F, and it opens it automatically. That's another way to get to it. But anyway, this stuff's been refined. I didn't invent it. You know, I've just observed it for 20 years, and it's just always worked that way for me. So back to the another thing I like to do, I can put a separator in here. Where's the separator? What is it? There's something in here that does a separator. My mind has gone blank. Okay, I'm going to fall on the source of all knowledge. Is it a different control? I didn't think it was a different control. No. Maybe it's stop it. There we go. Okay, so you just add a menu item and make the text a dash, a single dash character, and that adds a separator. Okay. Apologize for that. So I'm going to type capital E ampersand XIT, and I'll say ... on this, and maybe say shortcut key of Control X to exit. And the reason why I put the ... is I'm going to double click on it and say if message box dot show, are you sure? Give it a caption of confirm, and then say the option of message box buttons OK cancel. So if I get the result back dialog result.OK, return else. I think I want to say args E. There's something on here to cancel. Okay, fine. I think I'm going back too far. So all you want to do is say this dot close if they say okay. Does that sound familiar to anybody? I mean, you've got the, let me test this and make sure. So you've got the X button. So some people don't even program a file exit anymore because you can just click close. But if I say file exit, I get the are you sure? If I say okay, boom, this dot close causes it to cancel. And, you know, one thing that people observe when you start getting to this level of adding stuff to your application is, well, isn't that redundant if I've got the little X button up there? But again, one of the things about designing a well-behaved Windows application is that you want multiple ways to do the same thing. You know, a menu item, a control on the screen, a toolbar button, or shortcut key, all these different ways. It's different ways to do the same operation depending on which the user is comfortable with. One of the things that I always like to point out or recommend is that there are mouse people and there's keyboard people. I can kind of do either, but what I really like is when an application doesn't make me switch. If I'm using the mouse, I want to stay with the mouse as long as possible. When I switch to the keyboard, I want to stay with the keyboard as long as possible. It's that all moving your arm right and left and right and left. It starts getting your, you know, muscles, the repetitive stress injury stuff. I also want to point out how nicely it, when I put the text on the menu item, how it named these functions. So it says this is the open toolstrip menu item click, and this is the exit toolstrip menu item click. So it used the value of the word that I typed in here minus the ampersand symbol. It strips that out for you, and it uses that as the name of the menu item. So it kind of expects you to be using this pattern of developing your application and supports that and reinforces it. The other thing I like to add up here at the top menu, ampersand HELP, and underneath it, ampersand ABOUT ... And I like in all of my programs to add, see now we've got an about toolstrip menu item click, an about box. Let's see, what did I call this? Progress Manager version 1.0. So let's run that. Now I've got a help about, so I've got an about box. Doesn't really do a whole lot. I can replace it later with a fancy dialog box. It was really interesting back in the day, you know, people would spend a lot of time on their about box, putting their company logo in there and having all this other information. They may have a piece of, like a text box that kind of like scrolls with information about the company and links to support resources, all that kind of stuff they would build into their about box. And if a company had a suite of applications, they would have one, like maybe a library that had their about box code into it, and they would just drop it into every one of their Windows Forms applications so that they could all use a common about box technology kind of thing. But it was amazing the amount of engineering that went into the about box for applications. You don't see a whole lot of that much anymore. Anyway, so I have basically a standard application: file open, file exit, help about, and I can start building that from there. But the main thing is that's a demo of how you create a menu in Windows application. So I'll go back to the designer real quick. We can add a toolbar. So I put the focus back to the parent. Tool strip. Okay, so I have a basic tool strip up here. I'll put a button on it. The properties of the button. So there used to be like places where you could go and you could get a standard set of Windows user interface guidelines approved icons for open, close, save as, all those kind of things. Then they diverged wildly. You can see what the little open folder looks like for Visual Studio. And, I would often go around and just screen capture and grab the icons off of other applications that I liked. They weren't, back then it wasn't exactly free usage, but it also wasn't copyrighted either, so you could kind of get away with, and that's one of the things too, the theme was standardization. We wanted all the applications to use standard button icons so that people would recognize them. Oh, there's the picture of the little floppy disk. That's what I used to hit save, and you knew no matter what application you were using, that little picture of the floppy disk is going to say save. And the one with the little shadow disk behind it is save all, and then you'd have something else for save as, but and there's the open. So anyway, I could go hunt around or change the image, but all you got to do is come down here and just pick which image. It probably does make sense to explain this a little bit. There's an image container. Yeah, image list. So you add an image list to your form. Did you guys go over this in the other class? Okay, you notice that nothing appeared up here, right? It's just an image list. It's in the background. But it shows up down here in this little tray at the bottom. I can see here's my menu, here's my tool strip, here's my image list. And you come over here in the properties and you can add images to your image list. It's got a collection. So you click on the little thing and you add images. So you go out and browse for your icons and you add your images in here. And then on your toolbar, you reference which one of those images you want it to display for this control. That's how it works. The tool strip and the image list work kind of in conjunction with one another. But I'm not going to mess with that just because I'd have to go find a bunch of images, and I didn't prepare a list of those images ahead of time. But let's say you already have one. Let's say we added an image to this image list of the little file open folder, and it's sitting in here, and we attached it to this button that we added to the tool strip. The biggest thing I wanted to point out to you is if you double click on this little placeholder that you added to the tool strip, it goes to here, tool strip button 1 _ click. So I know that it generated code for this. So let me go over to the designer and find that. Designer generated code. So I look for the tool strip menu item 2, tool strip button 1. Let me find where they created that down here. Here we go. So they defined the click event for this as tool strip button 1 underscore click. So I can just come into the designer code and change this so that instead of calling that function, it calls my click event for my menu item, right? That would work. I think I can come over here though and just, if you look at these buttons up here at the top of the properties, you know, by default, the one is selected that says properties. It's got the little crescent wrench next to it. But if you click on the lightning bolt, then it gives you a list of all of the things, all of the events that you can intercept. And the click one is the only one that has something associated with it. So if I drop down this drop-down box, I see all of my other click events that it added to the code listed in here. It's just they built Visual Studio to be smart enough to go through that generated code and find all the ones that are underscore click to put in this list. And so I'm going to go to the open tool strip menu item underscore click and select that one instead. So now when I click on this toolbar menu or toolbar button, it'll do the same thing as the open menu item. So you don't have to, and you probably don't want to. And notice it deleted the method, the empty method that didn't do anything that I put in there. So again, when you change one of those, if it had generated one that didn't do anything, it just deletes that code for you. So it's pretty smart. It's got some nifty features. And now if I run my program, I've got another way to get to the file open. Hello, open menu item. I'm clicking on that. Also, notice when I hold my mouse over it, it says tool strip button 1. I don't want that. I want that. So I click on this and go to properties, and I come down here. There should be a text. Oh, I'm still on events, so I have to click back on properties. The text for it, let's say open. So run it again. Now when I hold my mouse over the button, it says open. So it's a little tedious, you know, and you have to do the same thing for every single application. I don't know, maybe you want to create one that's got all these nice features and then save it in GitHub as my starting point for a Windows Forms application project, and that way you can just kind of copy it whenever you want to start on a new one. And then, because we haven't even said what this thing is supposed to do yet, what this program is supposed to do, and we've had to do all this work. Well, before all this nice Visual Studio Wizard stuff, it was even worse. You had to do all this stuff in C, and the little partial class stuff, it was all one big C program. You could write 1,000 lines of C code before you even remembered what it was that the program was supposed to be about. So these are good days to be alive and to be a Windows Forms developer relative to where they've been. Yeah, I know. And we had to walk to school both directions uphill in 6 feet of snow. But it is what it is. Pretty nifty. So let's go back to our progress bar. The thing that I wanted to go into as a kind of a preview of the let me get back to where I was. There it is. I wanted to do this progress bar thing. So, you know, as a preview to multi-threaded stuff, it's a very common thing to do to want to add a progress bar to your application. You know, I'm going to do something that's going to take a long time, and I want a progress bar to display while it's working. So how about I create a button. Okay, so I've got this button. What am I going to do to my button? I'm going to change the text to start. I'm going to change the name. Instead of button 1, I'm going to say BTN start. BTN for button. So I use the convention of just all of my controls that I add to a window or add to a dialog box. I use this little 3-letter mnemonic at the beginning of it so I know what kind of thing it is. BTN start means it's my start button. Okay, let's see. So I can drag it around and say, there we go. It's got the right amount of white space between it and the borders of the progress bar. So it looks pretty good. I'll double click on it. And when I click the button start, I'm going to what is it? Timer.sleep. Not 30 seconds. How about 15 seconds? No, what is it? System.threading.timer.sleep. Oh, system.threading.thread.sleep. There we go. Not timer. So when I click on that button, it's going to sleep for 15 seconds and then stop. Okay, and at the end of it, let me say completed. So if I run this, there's my button. I click start, and notice I can click on things, nothing's happening. The program is completely unresponsive to me for 15 seconds. Until it says completed, and now I can use my application again. That is underwhelming, right? For a Windows application, we typically expect as users that my user interface is always responsive, even when it's doing something long running in the background, right? So this is our introduction to why the heck do I care about multi-threaded? Because I want my program to be responsive even if it's working on something. So how do I fix that? Well, we don't do the long running stuff in the code for our application. So I can say, they give us this cool little object here called background worker. So in my main form, I'm going to come up here at the top and I'm going to create a variable. I can make it private, who cares? Background worker. Okay, so now I've got one. It needs to be initialized somewhere. So I don't know. Where'd be a good place to initialize it? Maybe in my constructor. So background worker equals new background worker. So now it's declared, an object exists. So down here, I can say background worker dot do work, and I can tell it to do something. So the way this works is you're going to do work is expecting a function. So if I come down here and I create a function, private, doesn't have to return anything. Now it takes parameters. Notice it populates them for me. It takes a sender and an event args. Now this sender and event args, we'll probably talk about that more in the future, but that's a pattern for Windows controls and sending messages and things back and forth. You know, when we're doing Windows Forms programming, we're working in an event-driven paradigm where things that the user does generates events to our application, and those events have to be handled, and then they finish being handled and they give control back to the UI thread. So this is an event handler. Anything that you see that accepts an event args parameter is typically, you can say, oh, I recognize that as an event handler for something, some event. And this one is going to handle a do work event. And that's the reason why they have this class that they created called the do work event args. And so you would expect that that class has methods and properties associated with whatever do work is. So I can look, I can say e dot and bring up the list. Oh wow, it's got a result, a cancel, argument, result. You know, it's got all these methods and properties that I can look at and interrogate. Okay, interesting. But in this background worker do work, I'm going to put my thread sleep and message box.show. So here in my start click, I'm going to say plus equals background worker dot do work. No, I want you to do that one. So it was trying to be helpful there, but I had already created my method. I should probably just have let it generate that for me. It would have saved me a lot of typing. But anyway, there we go. And this is how you do it. This is how you invoke that background worker to do this thing in the background, is you attach an event to the do work for this background worker object. Yeah, and it should just invoke it. Okay, so let's see if that changes our behavior any. I run my program, I click the start. Yep, everything's still responsive. Is it doing anything? I don't know. But I know I can still do stuff here. Everything seems responsive, and we're thinking, okay, has it been 15 seconds yet? Has it been 15 seconds? I see it's still doing stuff, apparently. I think it's been more than 15 seconds, and I didn't see a message box show up. Okay, so it did the work in the background. And if I want to prove it to myself, I can set a breakpoint on this and run it. When I click on the start button, well, it didn't stop here. Oh, yeah. I didn't invoke it. I set the what I want it to do when it does that, but run worker async that actually invokes it. So this is what I want it to do when I invoke it, and this invokes it. So let's do it again. Okay, there's my program. I click on start, so it invoked it, stopped on my breakpoint, and I'll continue. So now it's running in the background. My program is still responsive. You know, it's still doing stuff. And then there's my completed. So 15 seconds went by and I got my pop-up. But I didn't block my program from being responsive while I did that. So, you know, to drive it home, I have two threads now. I have the main UI thread and I have this background worker thread that's running, and it's just sitting there waiting to be told to do something and then to start doing it. And when I did that, so now Windows has two threads and it's managing both of them. The background thread is locked. It's not responding to anything. It's just doing the work that you told it to do. But every now and then the main thread gets its chance to continue doing what it's doing and can respond to events still. So that's the proper way to do a long-running operation. And now the only other thing we want to add to this is we would really like some indication as to what's going on while it's doing it. So let's add our progress bar. Okay, I've got the group box selected, so I'll double click on progress bar, move it down here, make it that big. Okay, so now how do I interact with it? Let me rename it. It's progress bar 1. I'll just call it progress bar. So I have to kind of rethink my little template here. Instead of just sleeping for 15 seconds, I needed to kind of do something. Let's break this up a little bit. Okay, so 100 half seconds would be 50 seconds. Maybe that's too long. Maybe sleep for 1/10 of a second and do that 10 times, and that way it'll total take 10 seconds. Okay, so for int I equals 0, I is less than 100, I plus plus. So I'm just going to count to 100, and each time I do it, yeah, 1/10 of a second. This AI is just too helpful. Takes all the work out of it. I assume since I said sleep for 1/10 of a second, when it generated the code that it popped up, it automatically picked 100 because it read that. It's just weird. But in between here, I want to tell the background worker to report its progress. And what am I going to report? I'm going to report the number from 0 to 100. That's going to be my progress tracker. And now this is just convenient. It's going to start at 0 and go to 99, 0 through 99. If I wanted it to go 0 through 100, I could make it I is less than 101 or I is less than or equal to 100. I mean, this is not anything earth-shattering. But the only thing I wanted to point out here is when I go back to the designer and I click on the progress bar, notice how it's got a minimum and a maximum, and it by default is set to 0 and 100. I could make this, minimum of 7 and maximum of 12 if I wanted to. 7 is going to be no progress and 12 is going to be 100% progress. You can set those to whatever you want to, but 0 and 100 is a pretty good default to use, and it happens in this case to correspond with what my code is doing. 0 to 100, and the step 10, I'm going to change step to 1, because I wanted to go up by ones. Value 7, I guess when I changed it to a minimum of 7, it changed the value to 7, so I want to go back to a value of 0, and that made the little green bar go away. It's pretty neat how even in the designer these controls render themselves. If we had more time, I've actually built controls before, and then you get into the whole, it's not only how is it going to work when you're showing it in your Windows program, it's how do you want it to behave when you're modifying the properties in the designer. So it's kind of fun to create your own controls like that, and you can do it. If we don't get to anything like that, you can always just Google, how do I create my own toolbox control for a Windows Forms application. All right, so now I've got this 0 to 100, and in my code here, I'm counting from 0 to 100, and I'm reporting my progress. Let's see if that does it, if that has the effect that we want. No. Doesn't report progress. So there's other stuff that I have to do. So what? Oh, there's a progress changed event that I have to enable. Where is it? I've got an example over here that works I'm referring to, but I'm trying to build it up organically so that you can kind of see the process and what changes in the behavior here. Let me go look at it in the designer. That'll give me a click on this. Where is it? Well, it's the background worker that is the properties that I'm trying to change here, so. Okay, maybe I'll run it again and actually read what the event says. Invalid operation except the background worker states that it doesn't report progress. Modify worker reports progress to state. Okay. So that was my hint. There we go. Worker reports progress equals true. All right. So now let me run it. I click start and nothing happens. So I have to do the background worker dot progress changed Okay, here's the progress changed event. And so when that happens, this is, wait a minute, where'd you go? Oh, oops. So when I get this event, whenever the worker reports progress, I will say my progress bar dot value equals, and what do I change it to? Well, I got past that value in the event args. So my event args dot progress percentage, notice this is a progress changed event args class. So another kind of event, another event args class. So whenever I call background worker dot report progress, this little value that I add here gets added to a progress changed event args object with the value set to that value that I pass here. And then this gets called. So when I get that in this event, I set the progress bar's value. So now let me see if it actually changes. Yes. A lot of plumbing going on there. So now I can watch it get closer and closer to completing, and then I see the message box. Okay, so going through this again, I click the start button and this gets called. I say, when I do work on this background worker object, that means I want you to call this function. I want to tell it, yes, I want you to report progress, and when progress is reported, this is the progress changed event that I want you to call when that happens. Then, now that I've set up all my parameters, go. Do the work asynchronously in the background. Then it returns. It's already kicked off the other thread, and it returns control back to the main UI thread so it can continue processing other click events or other events. Okay, the background worker do work starts on this background thread, and it says, okay, let me start counting. Starts counting from 0 to 100. Each time it sleeps 1/10 of a second, and it says, okay, I slept for 1/10 of a second. Report the progress went from 0 to 1. All right. Report progress is going to say, create a new progress changed event args object, set the progress percentage property of that object to 1, and then invoke the progress changed event, passing this event args object to it. There's some magic that happens there where that goes from this thread with that data and gets invoked back on the original thread as an event. Now that's no different than if I had clicked on the open button on the toolbar. An event gets triggered for the UI thread, and the event handler gets invoked on the UI thread. Same here. It gets invoked on the UI thread, and the background worker progress changed event function gets called to handle that event. When that event handler gets called, it says, hey, you know that progress bar sitting there on my user interface? Change the value of it to 1. And then the little green bar goes bloop on the progress bar. So two things happening in, asynchronously with one another. The other thing that I want to do to sort of close the loop on this is I don't like this little part right here. The background thread function is invoking the message box. Yeah. That just, I don't like that. It makes me feel all dirty. What I want to do is say, run worker completed. So when the work is complete on that background thread, here's an event that I want you to fire. That's what I want to say. So I created a new event handler called run worker completed. It gets a, guess what? A run worker completed event args. Let's see, what is the, so we get an error, a result, canceled, interesting looking little properties there of that class. But for now, I don't care, because on the main UI thread, that's where I want to do this message box show completed. Similar to the way we update the progress bar status, when it's completed, I want the background thread to send me an event to say that you're done. So how do I do that? Where is it? Is it actually the status gets to the maximum? It might be. So let me do this. Let me see if that's how it reports completion. A little patience here. Okay, it's counting, it's counting, it's counting. 6, 7, 8, 9. There we go. Okay, so as a reminder, my status bar has a, where is it? Maximum of 100. So when my background worker reports progress of 100, the background worker assumes that it's done, it returns, and then run worker completed. See, I don't think that's right. I think what happens is when this method returns, so even if I didn't do this, even if it only goes from 0 to 99, and I don't ever report status of 100, I think just the fact that this function returns, it exits, says, oh, the background worker do work function finished, let me send the event. But I know that I can change the I can change the result somehow too. Let's see if this doesn't do it. Yeah, see, it still did it. So it's just the function returns that causes it to send that. There's also the ability to cancel this in the middle. I'm not sure I want to go into all that stuff, all the ins and outs. This is fine. So this is a good introduction to a reason why we want to use threads. And, you know, I've been talking longer than I wanted to, so I'll just stop here. Any questions at this point? Okay. So in summary, we played with some stuff on the UI. We have a program that will show you a menu, some dialogues, well, some message boxes, a toolbar with a button, and a progress bar that shows progress. And I guess all this is, again, preview to our game that we want to write. So one of the next topics we'll talk about is, what does it mean to, so all games, one of the defining characteristics of a game in a programming sense is that there's some kind of a game loop, okay? You're always going to ask, okay, what defines my game loop in a game? You got turn-based games and you've got what we would call a real-time game. You know, you're talking about a real-time strategy game. Action is happening all the time, and you insert your actions or your turns, if you will, into the sequence of what's going on in the rest of the game while it's running alongside you. In a turn-based game, it's the same thing, but some action happens and then the game pauses, and it gives you a chance to make your turn or decline to make a turn, and then the game processes again for a little while and then pauses again. That's the main difference between a real-time game and a turn-based game. So I don't really have a preference which you prefer to do, but you're going to have some kind of a loop. Now, in a classic console-based game, you don't have multiple threads. You don't have a user interface. You would say each turn you present the options or the user interface to the user and let them choose what do they want to do next. That's how you define your game loop. It's just a function that just keeps looping. It's like a for loop or a while loop. That's your game loop. But as we got into Windows environments, we want to kind of apply the same kind of technique we're talking about here, where we've got a user interface and we can make choices on our user interface, but the game loop is happening over here on this other thread. Can you still do turn-based games with that kind of a paradigm? Yeah, because one of the things we haven't talked here is synchronizing work between two threads. You would have your background worker thread doing some work and then signaling that I'm finished with that turn and I'm standing by waiting for my next instructions. And so that background thread would go to sleep, waiting for something to happen. The main thread doing the UI would sit there forever, all night long if you wanted it to, until you say, make my next move. You click a button or you enter a menu item or you type some text in and hit a button, whatever. At that point, the main UI thread sends an event back to the background worker thread, just like we've been doing here, and the background worker thread wakes up and says, oh, I have a user-made move event args that contains what the move was that the user selected, and it processes that move and then goes to sleep again waiting for the next move. So the two threads are just kind of communicating with each other. So that's basically how we're going to define our game loop, is in a background worker thread. The main UI, when you say start the game, will just do what we did here with this progress bar. It'll work very similar to a progress bar, and kick off the background worker, and then the two threads will communicate with each other about what they want to do. So this is a good tangible example to prepare for creating that game, because we're going to want to have a background worker. Okay? Fun stuff? All right, thank you for bearing with me. You know, I could sit here and apologize for being awkward about, you know, not knowing every single one of the answers or having to stop and look it up. But honestly, this is the way I code. I don't remember every option of every object, and when I forget, I stop and I go Google it and look at an example and say, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. All I'm trying to do is recognize the pattern. Oh yeah, 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 there's an event that does that. Oh no, there's a property I have to set to invoke that behavior, that sort of thing. Um, once you've seen all the patterns, then you can mimic them and you recognize what it probably is and you go find it, as opposed to trying to memorize everything. So I don't mind showing you that. I remember in one of my computer science theory classes, probably the smartest guy I've ever worked with was my mentor for my master's degree. And he, we had this one class where the entire class was about complexity, algorithmic complexity, and it was all proofs. You were all doing these mathematical proofs to try to prove asymptotic behavior of different algorithms. And I remember one time he came to class and he was just, the guy was amazing. He could usually just go to the whiteboard and he would just write a proof from his head without referring to any books or anything, stuff that I might at some point in my career achieve that level of expertise, and he could just do it off the top of his head. He was just a brilliant guy. But one time he came to class and he had some obscure proof that he wanted to show us, and he wrote some stuff on the board, and then he sat there literally just staring at the screen for 10 minutes while he thought about it and tried to figure out what the next step of the proof was. And we were all like, well, should we say something? Is he stuck? Should we go up and turn him off and on again? What's going on here? And he eventually worked through it, whatever he was thinking about, and then he went ahead and completed the proof, and he told us the same thing. He's like, that's the way this research stuff works. When you're sitting there proving something, you think about, should I do it this way? Should I do it that way? Should I do it this way? And then you pick one of them and you move forward. So it was really illustrative to see that, yeah, even he, as bright as he was, he still gets stuck too sometimes and has to work through it. But anyway, that's what it is. So I hope that helps, and hopefully this gives you more stuff to refer to when we get to putting it all together with that game. Should be fun.